Okay, I'm Sam, and this is episode 2 of the Illegitimate Scholar podcast. And what I'm going to talk about today is related to the first episode, which was about what is culture. And today I'm going to talk about competing identities that different people have. And I'll expand on that quite a bit. But the different types of identities that people hold, and these are very related to culture. So today I'm going to talk about a few different groups that had low levels of unity in their culture, low levels of like cohesion within that culture, and that could be because certain other cultures were considered more important, and that doesn't make sense when I say it, but it'll make more sense when I start talking about it. Entities with high unity, so these are groups with high unity. These are very resilient cultures. Resilient cultures that have stuck around for a long time, that are able to change with the times, to continue to push the culture forward. And then I'm going to switch to talking about how these concepts interact with the United States, with our current culture, and the problems facing America today in regards to, the people say that there's a culture war going on, and some people say that the culture war was already won by those on the left, and sometimes it seems like that's true. So competing identities. What I mean by that is everyone has a group of different identities. Everyone has different identities. You might identify as a man or a woman or something else, but you also identify as a member of a family. You might identify as a soccer fan, football fan, a fan of a certain team. You might identify with your job, your religion, different cultures. It could be something even smaller than that. Some people have tribal affiliations. Native Americans today, that's part of their affiliation, and they would still consider themselves Americans as well, from the United States. Some of them, I'm sure, don't, but most of them would consider themselves both tribal members and Americans. I consider myself an American and also an Irish American, which is more specific, but it's a different, more specific identity. And I think that at the root of a lot of what people's identities are is their strongly held beliefs. People have very strongly held beliefs when they are tied to their identity and their culture. A lot of pro-life people, a lot of people that are against abortion. This is something that people have been talking about a lot recently. Those ideas that they have for being pro-life, those are tied to their religion in a lot of cases. Their religious beliefs, which is their identity and their culture, that they view as very, very important. And they view the sanctity of life as very important. And on the other side, you have a lot of people who have what could be called a religious devotion to their described human rights, and they would be very in favor of abortion because they view it as a woman's right to choose autonomy over her body. And that's a very strongly held belief, just as strongly held in the other way. And, when there are competing identities, now, I mean, when I say competing identities in this case, I'm talking about between two different people that have to reconcile within a country, that can cause a lot of tension because two groups have very strong beliefs about this one particular topic, but only one of them can have their way. But also, there's competing identities within individual people as well. You might, in the Middle Ages, somebody probably this was before people had nation states. There was no nation of France or England. People would more likely identify with their religion. They would identify with their religion. They might identify with their local location or their ethnic group. Things were a little bit less diverse then. Today, when people live together, they're living in mixed communities, in the West at least. But if you go back in time, the minority populations of, for example, minority populations in different European countries, they weren't a lot of the times, except in cities, living in mixed villages. There were Jews who who were minorities of a place. They were a different ethnic group than the majority of people, but they're not living in mixed villages with other people. They're often in Jewish villages, which would be next to, maybe a Frankish village. And this is, again, pre-nation states. We're talking like Middle Ages. You're going to have different types of identities. They're not. People don't even today in the modern world think about themselves in the form of nation states all the time. I apologize for my breathing. I'm recovering from being sick a little bit. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up for that, and I'm going to talk about a few other things, but Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, it's a very tribal nation. A lot of what is done there is decided by tribal politics. And what that means is there's not this level of devotion to the nation state in Afghanistan that we saw in late 19th and 20th century Europe and America as well. And what that means is when you're trying to, as the West, trying to impose a nationalist structure, the structure of a nation state, onto a country that doesn't feel that way. They have this competing identity of being an Afghani, or that's what we might call them, an Afghani. I think Afghan means a rug, so an Afghani is a person. In a lot of places in Afghanistan, people, the idea of a nation state is very foreign to them. So being a citizen of Afghanistan, as opposed to what's much more important for a lot of those people, which is their tribal identity, or for people that are radical Islamists, the identity of being Muslim, which would tie them to the Taliban in a lot of cases, there's conflict there because you can't just force people to feel strongly towards this nation state in the same way that we do in the United States. A lot of people are very patriotic. It would be like if in America there was a larger devotion to your state than there was to the broader country, and that would have been very true about 200 years ago. And what we saw in the Civil War, in the American Civil War, was a breakdown in people sharing an identity, people feeling that their identity as Americans was most important. I mean, really, it was the fact that the upper echelons of Southern society were feeling that they no longer had shared interests with the United States to the north, largely because their economy was based on slavery. But there are other implications to the change in culture that results from having different economic interests. So anything that could divide people in the North and the South, divide them for their identity and their beliefs, yes, including the idea that slavery is okay in the South and the abolition of slavery in the North at the same time, it changes, like we talked about in the last video, when the environment of somebody changes, the things that are acceptable and like what that culture does and feels, that changes as well. It's your culture is formed out of your environment, human and physical. So my point, my overarching point, I think, for this is that having a shared identity as Americans is very important and integral to our success as a nation. It has been in the past and it is in the future, and this is true of all political countries, empires. This is something that's been important for all of human history, for anywhere. It's not just America. So I want to talk about a few entities that had low unity. There are a few political groups that have low unity or perceived, people. A lot of these people wouldn't have viewed themselves as very similar at the time, but when we look back, we can we see them differently from the vantage point of Western academia. We look back at these things from the position of anthropology and history, and view them through the lens of modernity, which is not how they would have viewed themselves. So this is an outsider's perspective always. But the first one is Native Americans. So when I first learned about, like, in this example, I'm talking about the Aztecs. So the Aztecs were, of course, an empire. Yeah, empire in Mesoamerica, in Central America, what's now Mexico. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, is on the spot where now is Mexico City. And when I remember learning about the Aztecs and looking back and thinking, like, first off, how is it possible that the Europeans were able to defeat them with just a few hundred people? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. It's too many people. How do you go into a place where there's like 1 million people there and, oh my God, a squirrel just fell out of that tree? Well, that's okay, because squirrels can survive terminal velocity, which is true. And I know that because of a YouTube video. But yeah, I'm sure that squirrel's alive. So, God, that's not something I thought was going to happen to knock me off. What the hell was I talking about? Jeez. Okay, so I'm back, and I've taken a shot of sriracha sauce to the back of the throat to try to get rid of my congestion. Different things. Both mean being blocked up. Okay, the Aztecs. The Europeans come in, the Spanish more specifically, they come in, and the reason they're able to take over is because they have all these tribes, kingdoms that are part of the Aztec Empire, and there's this ritualistic way that these people's kids are taken and publicly sacrificed in really gruesome ways. So it's not really like a surprise when you think, well, why would these people help the Spanish against the Aztecs? They have so much more in common with the Aztecs. And yeah, culturally, they did have so much more in common with the Aztecs. But that type of thing doesn't, just like the Aztecs didn't consider those people their people, even though we look back and we think, well, they're very similar cultures, that doesn't mean much when your children are being like taken year after year and you're living in terror of these people that are your imperial overlords. And these people are they're not thinking about and they shouldn't, but they're not thinking about like the geopolitical implications long term of the Spanish coming in, a very different people, and establishing rule over all of them, which is what eventually happens. And a lot of these Native American groups that were initially allied with the Spanish, and this happens in North America as well, they're eventually, discriminated against, made second-class citizens, driven off their land, things like that. Used as slaves in the encomienda system, in this case, literal slaves. In North America as well, a lot of Native American tribes, they were attempted enslavement against a lot of them, especially early on, which was, at the same time, basically the standard of warfare for all of human history up until around that point. That was kind of what war was about, taking captives and taking other people's riches. That was what it was a lot of the time. But ultimately, while they had these similar cultures, what was important to them were these these more real things. They had like from outside, the Aztecs and the people around them, they look like they have similar culture, and they do, but what those people found important was what we might call minute differences in the cultures and the very real taking of the children and people from the society and literally cutting their hearts out and eating them while they're still beating. So that will trump any sort of, these people look like me kind of argument, which is common to modern, postmodern American and Western thought. But what that ultimately means is, because there was no way because these people weren't united in the same way, they weren't going to stand a chance up against the Spanish, because the Spanish were united and they brought people and they were able to play off of those very real rivalries. And it's the same thing that happened in North America. But ultimately what that comes down to was they weren't unified. They didn't have a similar culture. And it's a lot of these cultures that are able to expand and become very prosperous. A lot of the times it has to do with reducing the conflict between two places. And this, or within groups of people, that really does make you stronger. Like, there was a lot of propaganda about this at the beginning of the country. I mean, this is ultimately why the United States accepts slavery when it becomes a new country, because the founding fathers were very worried about a situation where the former colonies were going to be disunited. They were worried that, and this is a very real worry, and this is something that did happen a lot in South and Central America and still does today, is they were concerned that if the states were not unified under a central government whose power they wanted to limit, but if they were not organized under that, there would be constant wars and infighting and bickering over all of the land, the people, control over resources. So the best way to dissuade that is to make everybody together, and everybody can get more prosperous. And it does end up working, essentially, with some hiccups, if you can call a civil war a hiccup. But the United States comes out of that a united country. It doesn't come out of that, two different sides that have constant fights with each other, and they're draining their resources because they're fighting each other. And you can see that in India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan. You can see that in North and South Korea. What you don't see is a fight between North and South Dakota. North and South Dakota are pretty cool with each other, all things considered. They're not killing each other. And it's better for everybody when that's the case, which is also why it's good for us that, the United States doesn't go to war with Mexico or Canada, two of our closest allies. So a lot of times, yes, technological advancements are good, but the Spanish weren't that much more technologically advanced than the Native Americans, especially 16th century, 17th century. The Europeans aren't more advanced. They're just not. The weapons that they're using are very primitive. These primitive firearms are not better than, there's some psychological damage when you're fighting against people who don't understand, but they're not stupid. Within a few years, Native Americans are like, oh, that's a gun. It works like this. It's not magic. It doesn't take them long. It doesn't take anyone long to figure that out. So besides that, they're not more effective than bow and arrows, which don't jam. The bowstring can break, but these are very complex. They're created over thousands of years of culture to work very well, and they fire at a very high rate of speed. And with using brass and other metals that they get from Europeans, they're able to make even more effective projectiles. So, it takes up until the 19th century for certain parts of the center of the country to become pacified. And pacified meaning basically the removal of Native Americans from that land, which comes with it basically genocide. I'm not going to skirt around that. That is what it is. So it's not the technological advance that really gets the Spanish and other European powers victories in Native America and other places. It's a difference in political organization, which is not a physical technology, but it's a type of what's the word? Not integration. What's the word? Development. You have to develop these cultural ideas, and they are attached to technology. Like having more quick ways of transportation. Having communication that comes later. British bureaucracy was, famous for being extensive, but Spain, is a unified country it's a unified kingdom at the time. They unify in 1492, the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, they unified together. They don't make Spain until, I think, the grandson of Philip, or not Philip. Philip is the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. finally unites the two kingdoms. But until then, it's a personal union, and they're very united. They're advanced in the bureaucratic social organization, and they're united in a way that that the Aztecs were not, and as a result, that's really why they're able to win, because they're able to play off of these divides in the people there. And the divides in the people there were important, but until they're and they worked for the Aztecs for a very long time, and they would have kept working if this random cog didn't come in. And we're gonna do another example from earlier in time. Gallic tribes, which I would say, in a lot of ways, were less advanced than Mesoamericans. So Mesoamericans in the 16th century and the 15th century, they have like cities that rival the greatest cities in the Middle East, Europe, and China. Maybe the most, massive pyramids that rival the pyramids in Egypt. These are advanced people, advanced, and they also have advanced, like sky knowledge. Forgetting the word for astronomy. Yeah, they have advanced astronomy and things like that. I don't think the Gallic tribes, which is in what is now France, who were being attacked by the Romans, specifically Caesar, they didn't have like large cities. They were chiefdoms that were spread out quite a bit more. And the phrase divide and conquer comes out of Julius Caesar saying divide and conquer to the Gauls. That was his plan: divide the groups and conquer them individually. And Vercingetorix, the leader of the Gauls, who ends up being the leader, he's able to somewhat unite these Gallic tribes. Boudicca does the same thing for the Britons in what's now England. But they're only able to become united when the environment requires it. And that is when the Romans come in. So they don't have a lot of time. People don't. If the Romans come in and they create now there's a threat where it makes sense to unify together, but you still have all these other issues, these old rivalries where people are doing horrible things to each other. There's mass rapes and murders and killings. Like, you can't expect people to get over the worst things that have ever happened. This is a time when genocide is a Tuesday. Whole people groups are being wiped out in an afternoon. It happens a lot in this time in history. And people being enslaved, and horrible things are happening. But Vercingetorix and Boudicca in these two different places, they have the task of unifying these people whose cultures are very similar, but their rivalries and their feuds with each other are very personal and very real. And their identities, the identities of these people, are to their tribes. It's not to their greater culture. It's not like we say the Gauls because we call them the Gauls. But they wouldn't call themselves Gauls. They would have been whatever tribe they were. I couldn't name one right now. But they were not people who saw themselves as similar. And in a world where a organization like the Romans, a political organization like the Romans that has very advanced unity, they have a very advanced bureaucratic system, and they're one large united force most of the time. We know that the Roman generals do go to war with each other, and that's a fallback of this system, but they're able to unify enough, and they're able to control this large territory because of this advanced culture of having unity and these people's identities being linked together. And the Gauls, they can't fight that. They can't fight that. They lose. They fight very hard and they lose. And the same happens to Boudicca, I think. And this divide and conquer strategy, this only works when there's always divides to exploit, but it only works if those divides can be exploited or they're naturally differentiated enough that the culture that someone's trying to take over is very weak. And when I say weak, I don't mean it's like a bad culture. I just mean that, like, if the larger culture is the Gauls and there's a few million Gauls, but all of those millions of Gauls, they don't view themselves as Gauls. They might, kind of think of themselves as, we're this group of people, but what is much more important to them is their affiliation with their tribe. So they're not going to they're not going to toss aside their tribal affiliation for the larger Gallic affiliation unless it really serves them, and that would be a very difficult thing to do. But in America, it's very different. In America, in modern times, I'm a New Englander and I'm a white guy, and I have my religious beliefs, but none of those are as important as being an American. And that's that identity of being an American is going to trump those other identities. I mean, not always, but it's like I'm not going to I wouldn't go to war with another state. I wouldn't sign up if the Connecticut National Guard started drafting people door to door to go fight New York. We're going to have a New England coalition and we're going to fight the people from New York. I'm not fighting a New Yorker. It's like I'm going to yell at them in sports. I'm not going to fucking kill them. I don't want to kill that guy. But that's not the same for the Gallic people. The Gallic people are, killing other Gallic people all the time. They're like, yeah, he's another Gaul. Who gives a shit? He's a goddamn Arduini or whatever the hell their tribe is. They don't like those people. Their tribal affiliation, their tribal identity was more important to them to their national identity. So I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. I'm going to get back to talking about America in a little bit. But after talking about these places with low unity, and eventually a lot of them do get higher unity over time. Obviously, Mexico is a mestizo country largely. There's they actually do have racial issues like we have here. In America, a lot of times people from Latin America are viewed as like, oh, if you're a Mexican is your race. But Mexican's not a race. Mexican, like American, it's a nationality and it's a country, but Mexican says nothing of your racial makeup. I mean, generally, Mexicans are mestizo, which makes them a mix of Spanish or white European blood and of indigenous blood. And that's true, but it's not always true. There's also some black people in Mexico, and there's some mix in that and a lot of things. And for a lot of time, the people that had power in Mexico were, and I think in a lot of ways still are, more white descended, more of that Spanish blood, that Peninsulare blood that they have. And they have similar racial issues that we have in the United States. And there's also other races that emigrated to Mexico. Like the U.S., Mexico has a population of immigrants from Asia and from Africa as well. It's not a Mexican's not a race. It's just not. Yeah. So Mexico starts out with this invasion by the Europeans, and they kind of they create a country with the indigenous people. I mean, largely it's a settler colonial state. It has this apartheid system, this encomienda system that has this system of racial authority and similar feudal-ish system to what is done in Europe in a lot of places. But eventually it turns into this multi-ethnic state that, of course, has its racial issues and its inequalities, but it is a state that is at least unified mostly. Like, as we all know, there are certain places where Mexican organized crime has power and the Mexican government does not have like real functional power in those areas. But Mexico as a state is better than a lot of places. It's not like Liberia or some of the breakdowns in Zimbabwe or not the Dominican Republic. I mean, there's some problems with the Dominican Republic, probably more so than Mexico, but the Democratic Republic of the Congo has a lot of issues. So a lot of those places have higher unity now. They got more unity as a response to having to deal with the Roman invasion or the Spanish invasion. And a lot of times that is being inflicted upon them, but over time it becomes the general structure. Like the Gallic peoples would eventually form into larger political organizations. And this was directly as a result of needing to innovate after being invaded by the Romans, but Gauls and Germans Germanic peoples, they eventually conquer Europe, or they conquer Rome, and they split up into these larger groups that become the precursors to modern states like France and Germany and Austria. So entities with high unity over time. There's a number one, and it's not really even close. It's China for me. China is, and there's other cultures that aren't like a ethnicity and a nation like that, but I think across all different identities you could possibly have, China is the one with the best unity overall. It has the most persistent culture because it continues to come back. And in the West, we have Rome. We have Rome. That Rome and Greece are viewed as like the ancient pillars of civilization, and a lot of the Middle East as well, for religion as well as for the countries. We'd look at like Mesopotamia, but the Chinese civilization is a contemporary of both the Romans and I think of Mesopotamia, at least the precursors to what is now the Chinese civilization. And while we talk about heirs to Rome, when people talk about the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, they talk about them as an heir to Rome. But after that, nobody else really has as big of a claim. The Holy Roman Empire tries. Mussolini with the fascists, he tries. The Ottomans kind of claim it. But there isn't really a true heir to Rome. The Italians are the Italians. They're not Romans. Some of them might like to think of themselves as Romans. Whereas the Chinese state is the Chinese state, and it occupies much of the same territory. And it's been around forever. And it does break up. And it's broken up multiple times. The Three Kingdoms period, the Warring States period, the 16 Kingdoms period, the Northern and Southern dynasties, the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, the Northern and Southern Song, and then the Warlord period, which leads into the civil war between the communists and the nationalists. And each of these broke up the Chinese empire. Each of them broke up the Chinese state, and it was broken up in these tumultuous periods for centuries or decades at the least. And this happens multiple times throughout history, and they always come back together. And that's crazy. That's like the Chinese state today. It doesn't have Taiwan, or Formosa is what the island's called, but it has all the territory, all the mainland territory that it kind of ever did. I mean, there's a few places where, Mongolia might have been included. I think they took over Vietnam, which has a very resistant, prevalent culture as well, for a little bit at certain points in history. But most of all of the Han Chinese ethnicity, which is 90% of the Chinese population, all of their core territory is in the hands of the Han Chinese, and there's more Han Chinese now than there have ever been. And that's not true for the Roman Empire in any case. I mean, it would be like if Italy and Spain and Portugal and France and Greece and the Balkans and all of North Africa and Turkey all joined together and consider themselves one people. There's nothing else in the world that compares to that. And I'm going to do an entire video on that, but that's an example of a culture with high unity. It has a lot of unity of that culture, and a lot of that identity is so strong. And I think it's because it's tied to all these other things like Confucianism and legalism, and these different types of thought that are somewhat religious, but they're also ancestor worship. It ties people to both the land and to each other as Han Chinese people, because that identity trumps all. And they're and pretty much every culture ever is, but they're less individualistic and more communal than Western cultures. Another one is Islam. Islam has a resiliency because of reasons that I talked about in the last video, but the caliphates, these Islamic empires, they last for centuries and centuries, and they're huge. They're massive. Christian kingdoms just were never able to create large enough empires like that. They couldn't create that type of unity, or maybe it was better suited for the environment because in the deserts, it's easier to get around on horseback versus like, all the rivers in Europe. It's much more buttoned up. It's not buttoned up. It's like it's a much more, it's a dotted territory with more physical landmarks. I mean, that's why Switzerland is the way that it is. But Islam was able to create a culture that produced an incentive for people to join it, to stay as Muslims, and to expand the religion both in converts and in growing the territory, conquering it. They were able to do this very effectively. Even today, the Islamic State, which tried to take over in the 21st century in the area of Iraq and Syria, people were amazed at how quickly the Islamic State was able to take off. And I think that there were a lot of, it's a very complex thing that's going on, but Islam has a long history of having caliphates. It's ingrained in the Muslim religion because the Muslim religion has existed for so long, mostly under those caliphates. For most of Islamic history, like more than 90%, they were involved in caliphates. And I think that the religion, the rules are in the writings and the teachings, when they are combined with that type of political institution and intertwined for so long, it's really hard to get rid of that. That doesn't go away easily. And really the countries that exist today, they're not countries that were created from grassroots, like at the bottom efforts. Like they were created as a result of colonialism from Europeans. So it's just, those countries don't make as much sense. A lot of those countries are a lot better off than a lot of countries that happened as the results of colonialism in Africa and even South and Central America. But that doesn't mean that they're not still imposed countries. They have a little bit better political organization, but a lot of that is tied to a lot of turmoil in the 20th century. And a lot of them are dictatorships, which it's an authoritarian state that has some similarities to some of these caliphates of the past. But that's a religion in a culture with a high level of unity and resiliency. And it's possible that in the future we will see another caliphate. And that doesn't mean that it has to be like a caliphate that's like the Islamic State. It's very possible it won't. But in Europe, they have the European Union, and I wouldn't be surprised that when all these different countries, they have their nationalities, but they also have a shared identity as Muslims. It would not surprise me if there was some sort of superstructure of Islam that gets created that matches the European Union, especially for the Arab world, because the Arab world, these people consider themselves, a lot of them, the same ethnicity, and they are. Arab is an ethnicity, and that spans multiple countries. And there are minorities as well. There's Kurds and there's Berbers and things like that, and people like that in North Africa and the Middle East. But there's also this identity of a lot of Arabs. So that high unity is not going to go away. Okay, so the steppe tribes as well. That's another group, and this one's a bit of this one. I put this in here so I could discuss it a little bit, because the steppe tribes, and I'm talking about like the Mongols, the Huns, the Golden Horde, they come from the steppes of Asia. And what happens basically every few hundred years for a while is some dude, it's always a dude. They're about to go on a rampage of war. So of course this is the domain of men. Yay us. We're great. We do great stuff in history. So every few hundred years, a bunch of these guys get together somehow, and they start, and they have this extended identity, and they identify themselves with the Huns, with some sort of banner, some sort of legitimacy comes out. Temujin, who would eventually be Genghis Khan, he has legends about him, and he becomes this great leader that's able to unite all of these tribes, and they invade everywhere. They just go invading, and in a mix of places that when you read them, you're like, how the hell did one group of dudes, one group of people go around to all these different places? But they're able to do that. But what happens is these things fall apart very quickly. There is high unity initially, and they're able to create spontaneous high unity. But within a few generations, that dissipates, usually within the lifetime of one specific leader. Genghis Khan dies, and then there's Kublai Khan, and there's a few others, but his empire is split up. It's not manageable. They don't have the technology to extend over this huge of an area. And no one really, and a lot of these places that were being attacked were in the East. I mean, eventually they do come into Europe. They do, but a lot of these places are in the East. A lot of it is in the former territory of the Soviet Union. It really isn't until the 20th century that anyone is able to unite a lot of these places. The Soviet Union, with newer modern technology, they're able to unite Russia, and Russia at that point includes all of these people that were attacked and taken into the fold, like Chechens, Dagestanis, Tuvans, different groups of people that are minorities in Russia, many of them living in the eastern edges of Russia, where people couldn't get there before. But the technology is what allows a high unity over a farther period, or over a farther area. And so these steppe tribes, they have high initial unity, and that falls apart because it's not being held together by a political structure very well. They do have political structures, and they do have religion, and a lot of them end up converting to Islam. A lot of the times, that's a religion that it has a lot of appeal to them for, I think, obvious reasons. It's a religion that spread on horseback that had to do with trading, which the Mongols, I know they're known for fighting a lot, but they also did a lot of trading and got very prosperous by connecting these large areas and turning them into one political religious organization, which is also how Muslims got rich. So it makes sense. And these caliphs got prosperous. It makes sense that they would convert to Islam because it serves them. So all of that being said, I want to talk about the implications of what this means for America, and what having a high for a long time, Americans have thought of themselves as Americans largely. And, that broke down during the American Civil War. It had to be an identity that had to be created through propaganda, through lots of books, myths, things that were created and that people latched onto, and that, the public school system pushes, and these things that make it important for Americans to be Americans. And this is kind of the cornerstone of the country existing. The United States is a social construct, like all countries. And it's not a nation state in the sense, like in France, there's the French ethnicity and the French language, they come organically, but we don't speak American in America. We speak American English. We speak a version of a language from another country. And we don't share an ethnicity with each other. I mean, a lot of people don't. Like in the Midwest, there's lots of Germans. Where I am in New England, southern New England, there's lots of Italians and Irish. What unites us, like I guess there is a white identity in the United States, and there's a black identity, and there's these different identities. But the identity of being an American is what unites us, and it's what makes us not prioritize, like I am Irish American, which is not a type of Irish, it's a type of American. I'm an Irish American, but that doesn't mean that I have a problem with people of a different ethnicity than me. I don't have a problem with somebody who's not Celtic or not Irish in blood. I like them. Or I don't like them. They're just people. I make that decision. But I understand that they're also Americans, and that's the thing that's most important. But what can happen, and I think what is really possible to happen in our lifetimes, even if people don't believe it, and when you think about it, this will happen eventually, is that the United States will break up. The United States is not going to exist forever. No political institution is going to exist forever. It's not possible. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I don't think, and I hope that the United States doesn't break up in my lifetime, but it's a possibility. It's always a possibility. And something, horrible happened. I don't think if you asked Germans in the 1930s, they would say that, yeah, Germany won't exist in 1955. But that's true. In 1955, Germany doesn't exist. There's West Germany and East Germany, but they're not united as one people. And that could happen to the United States as well. It's possible. What happens if America's never lost a war. And I know somebody hearing that is going to be like, yeah, well, you lost Vietnam, you lost these other things. Yeah, and the White House was burned down in 1814, but it's not a loss in this. Even if your capital is burned down, the war kind of turned around and the British they didn't have a total win. Okay. They weren't able to push their demands. What could have happened is the United States being brought back under the British Empire. That was on the table at the time. I don't know how possible that is, but it really does depend on the strength of the American identity and the strength of the American political institution that's tied to it. But the Vietnamese didn't march down Washington even. They didn't land on the United States. So yeah, the war was a loss in the sense that, like, I'm going to do a whole video on this and expand on it, but we could lose a war in the sense that there's Chinese boots marching down Washington, D.C. There's things similar to the Nuremberg trials for our generals that we watch. And there could be a forced destruction of the United States by something else. And if there isn't a American identity that persists through the destruction of our country, which could be forced on us by someone else, it could very easily stay like that in perpetuity forever. In Germany, West and East Germany split up, and they're split up for 50 years, I think, maybe 55, something like that. But they come back together eventually. But North and South Korea have been split up for 80 years. There isn't even a feasible idea of how they're going to get back together. It doesn't seem possible at this point. And people might have said the same thing for Germany at some point. But it really doesn't seem possible with Korea. So, the idea that Americans have about being Americans and how we prioritize that identity is very important for the future of the country. We don't have like the French ethnicity backing our country or whatever other ethnicity you have. We only have the idea that we're Americans and the myths that we have associated with it. So one of the things that I've seen, and this is from following what's going on in education in the country, and this is, this quote isn't, or me saying this is not a quote. It's a general feeling, but it's also something that I've had explicitly told to me by professionals in education. Is that there's a broad shift in education, especially in certain states, from assimilation to accommodation, and this is a very big difference. As in not assimilating the American culture being the goal of public education, but being accommodating to all different cultures and identities. And it's good to be accommodating to cultures and identities of different people. And, if you're in a classroom in New England, you're going to have kids from anywhere, many, many Hispanic kids. You'll have from many different places. There's Peruvians, Mexicans, of course, many, many different Central Americans, as well as Dominicans, Haitians. I've met Venezuelans, Colombians, Nicaraguans, El Salvadorians, all different places. And then there's immigrants from even more recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, like there's Albanians and Bosnians. There's Turkish people. There's lots of different people in America, and accommodation. What accommodation sounds like to me is that if the goal is not assimilation, it feels like there isn't an emphasis on all of us being Americans, and it seems like other identities are being pushed above the American identity, and that's not it's not always that extreme. In a lot of cases, especially in public schools, they're still doing these patriotic, a lot of times bordering on nationalistic things, like that I have mixed thoughts on, like the Pledge of Allegiance. But there's a general consensus that they should be accommodating to different people's culture. And I don't know what implications that has for future identities, but it feels like if the American identity becomes less and less, it becomes less and less important to people, then I think that the days of the United States as a political entity are limited. Because if people aren't interested in their American identity, then what are they going to see that they have in common with people from another part of the country that are likely a different religion than them, or they're irreligious, so they don't care. Anybody else who's irreligious is kind of similar to them, but somebody who is religious is definitely not their religion, who's a different ethnicity than them, who lives in a different part of the country than them, and has a different and they might live in a rural area, and like a different person might live in a rural area and they live in the city. They have nothing in common with somebody in another part of the country if they don't consider themselves Americans and they don't place that American identity high up. And that's a very dangerous idea, because there already has been violence between Americans, political violence happening. And there's been political violence by both sides of the political spectrum all over. There's been, and if you're somebody that only listens to liberal media, you're only going to see examples of conservatives committing political violence against people, mostly left-wing people. And if you're conservative and you're only watching conservative news, you're going to only see the opposite. You're going to only see political violence committed against conservatives. And both of those things are happening. I promise you, they're both happening. I could make examples, but they're not hard to find. All you have to do is Google them. And they're becoming more common, as far as I know, which is not good. It's not good at all. And this is something that's going to take like generations to happen, but the gears could already be turning towards that right now. These kind of like large geopolitical things, you see them brewing for a long time, and it might be hard to really, it might be hard to predict something so terrible happening. But if there is another situation in history that you can draw parallels to, and then you can draw a line to something that where the trend is going towards something like that, eventually with certain things there has to be a breaking point. There has to be a breaking point with something like the statistic that I have here, which is a Pew Research poll from 2022 found that 71% of Americans believe that Americans have lost trust in each other over the last 20 years. And that's a trend that seems to be getting worse. And it was getting worse over time when this question was asked. And then a CBS poll found that out of 4 options, I think this one was from like 2019, 2020, the greatest threat to America's way of life was other Americans at 54%. The other 3 options were economic forces, natural forces like the pandemic, and foreign threats at only 8%. So the majority of people asked amongst these 4 things, and keep in mind, this was pre all the issues with Putin, but the greatest threat to America's way of life was other Americans at 54%. That is a scary thing for me to read, because when I read that, I feel that that means that the majority of Americans polled by CBS, their biggest problem out of these 4 options is other Americans. Other Americans are the greatest threat to their way of life. So if another American is the biggest threat to your way of life, then like you either have that's horrifying. I'm almost speechless. I was very surprised when I read that, because other Americans are a threat to your way of life. Then what does being an American mean? What are you sharing with that other American if they're the one that's a threat to your way of life? If your way of life isn't decided by you being an American, that isn't what you view as creating your way of life, then what is our country? Your way of life is detached from the country, then why is the country existing when other people that are Americans are a threat to you? And of course, it's specific types of Americans, usually those that are farther away geographically and far away in the way that they live their life. But it didn't used to be like that. There's a lot of different reasons why it's like that, but the implications of that are horrifying. And I think it speaks to people placing other identities over them, either racial identities, ethnic identities, religious identities, state identities, and region identities. People, a lot of people in New England identify with New England. When I go to another place and they ask me where I'm from, I don't say my state. I say I'm from New England because I prioritize that identity over the state identity. But I don't prioritize it over being an American in most cases. And I think it's not that many right now, but I think that's what we're trending towards. And people can say I'm a doomsayer, but like I said, all things come to an end. It's a matter of time. And I'm not even saying it might be soon, but if the trend is getting worse, then unless that trend is reversed, then what do you think is going to happen? Okay, so I talked way more than I thought I was going to, and I think I got it. I was kind of all over the place, but that's kind of how I talk. So I'm going to work on it a little bit, but if you better get used to it. If you don't like me being all over the place, you probably shouldn't listen to this because I'm gonna try my best, like I just said, but I'm not going to do that good of a job. I don't think. Not do that good of a job at not being all over the place, which is. But if you want somebody who's all over the place, then I'm your fucking guy. All right.